Have you told your friends that you see ghosts?
Oh, absolutely not.
Gina Rodriguez returns in Not Dead Yet.
I'm back, baby.
Who is that?
Oh, she's the obituary writer.
And Brad Garrett joins the brilliant ensemble cast.
Titan, Maverick, Titan of all Mavericks. These are all words used to describe me.
Not Dead Yet. Season premiere. Tonight, 8:30, 7:30 Central on ABC. And stream on Hulu.
It's the Happy Families Podcast.
Today's conversation is not a conversation for kids. We encourage parents to make sure that you're aware of who's listening to this discussion and make sure that only mature ears are participating in today's Happy Families podcast. Hello, my name's Dr. Justin Coulson. I'm here with my wife and mum to our 6 daughters, Kylie, Mrs. Happy Families. By now, you would probably be well aware if you listen to the podcast or follow us on social media that we've had a pretty rough week. Yesterday's podcast was one of the most important conversations we may have ever had on the podcast. I hope that you got a lot from it. When I posted about my nephew's death last week, we were overwhelmed with the incredible volume of support, but also grief that was shown on those social media platforms, on Facebook and on Instagram. And one thing that we saw more than perhaps anything is just how many people have been touched by profound loss through suicide. Many, many, many people said to us, how do we talk to our kids about this? And so that's what we're going to attempt to answer in today's conversation. And because we try on this podcast to make this a podcast for time poor parents who do just want answers now, we're going to do our best to move through this at a pace that is respectful and considered, but that also is very much about getting straight to the point.
I think this is a conversation that nobody wants to be having with anyone, but especially your children. And you think about your job as a parent, it's to protect them and to have to open their eyes and hearts up to just the pain of these kinds of conversations. It's really hard.
So we've had several of these conversations over the last few days, as you would probably be aware, with that many kids and that many questions. So let's dive into it. Lots of people have been asking. And I should also mention the principles that we're sharing will apply across the board when it comes to talking about profound loss and specifically suicide with your children. But the closer you are to the pain and the grief, the more these things will be helpful. If you are at a distance and it's a friend of a friend or your children overhear something, then you'll probably be able to go a lot lighter on the things that we're talking about. Nevertheless, the same principles will apply, and it will be up to you as a parent to use your discretion to step into these conversations wisely and with so much compassion. The first thing that I want to emphasize is that we have limited research evidence on how to conduct these conversations, specifically on this topic. Now, there's plenty of research out there about how to have difficult conversations, and that's what we're primarily going to lean on. There is only a little bit of evidence that's out there. It's not particularly strong, and I guess we can be grateful for that. If there's no need to have the conversation, I would actually discourage you from having one. And there are plenty of times where there might not be a need. For example, there may be considerable distance between the person who has died and your child. They may not even be aware of them. Or there may be just a cursory discussion where we can say, yes, we're really sad because a friend of ours has passed away, has died. And that's kind of all you need to do when there is distance. As the relationship gets closer, that's when we obviously begin to address it. I guess the other thing that I'd say as a preliminary discussion point is we really want to keep it level. Suicide can provoke very strong reactions in us and even in our children. It seems that there's a visceral and immediately recognized understanding that what we're talking about is serious.
I think from my end, the most important thing for me was that our relationships with our children are built on trust, and that while these conversations are really hard, honesty is really important.
I've always defined trust as believing that the other person is going to act in your best interests. And in conversations like these, our children need to really believe that we are going to act in their best interests. And all of the research evidence from places like the National Centre for Childhood Grief, I've looked up so many research articles and so many tip sheets and fact sheets on this, and every single university, every single psychology clinic, everyone who's out there consistently says honesty is the best policy.
I think it's showing our children that we actually honour the questions that they have. They need to know that as their parents, we're willing to go to the hard places to help them understand the world better.
The real trick is doing it in an age-appropriate way. It has to be developmentally appropriate. So let's talk about some developmental realities here. We'll start with the youngest children. For young children, and I'm talking about kids under 6 or 7. So when we've got 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds, you can almost say nothing. I mean, literally, they're just not going to be attentive enough and picking up on it unless it's somebody within their immediate family or somebody that they were extremely close to. Let's assume, though, that it is somebody that they're extremely close to. Keep it simple and go with what I call the fire hose principle. I've shared this in a variety of different contexts over the years on the podcast and elsewhere. But essentially, if somebody's thirsty, it would be rare that we would hand them the fire hose, tell them to open up their mouth, and then crank that bad boy up. That's going to cause potentially a whole lot of damage. And it's certainly going to do anything except quench their thirst. Our job as parents is not to tell them everything. And the younger they are, the more this principle applies. But even as they get older, we still need to be judicious and discerning in what we say. Rather than turning on the fire hose, it's much better when somebody says, I'm thirsty, to give them a glass of water. And once they've completed that glass of water, simply to say, would you like any more water? And refill it, or give them a half a cup, or whatever it is that they need. When it comes to talking about difficult topics, and particularly a topic such as suicide, the fire hose principle applies. Give them a sip, and if they ask for another sip, let them have that. Our children will have questions. We should answer those questions in a developmentally appropriate way to the degree that they're curious, but no further. They may say something like, what does dead mean? I mean, if they're young enough, they may not. Children don't understand the permanency of death, especially when they're around that 3 or 4 age group. It's once they get 4, 5, 6. When are they
coming back?
Yeah, when will they come back? And that's why it's important that we don't use phrases like gone to sleep or gone away. We need to be much more concrete. In fact, when I wrote the article that went onto social media and was obviously seen by so many people after it was published, the hardest sentence for me to write and then to read and to have my parents and my siblings and my nieces and nephews read was the 3 words, because he's dead. And yet those words matter in being straightforward and simple and truthful with our kids. If they're young, you might say, do you know what being dead means? And you can give them examples of a pet that died, or perhaps grandparents or an auntie or uncle that died. But they need to understand what dead means. And when it comes to something like suicide, it's completely appropriate for you to say something like, this person had a disease in their head and they died. It's very sad. Now, a statement like that is truthful. We know that things like depression are diseases of the mind. And when we say that, for a young child, that can often be enough. Now, as they get older, if that stays with them and they contemplate it, they may come back to us and say, how? What does that mean? What does a disease in my head mean? Can I get a disease in my head? And then they're looking more for empathy than they are looking for definite, clear answers. And they need a little bit of both in those circumstances. We want to answer them honestly, but with lots of empathy. But for young children, those would be my central points. Keep it really simple. Use the principle of the fire hose. Make sure that they understand what being dead means, and emphasize that this person had a disease in their head and they died, and everybody's very sad about that.
I was kind of hoping that that's what we'd get away with our 9-year-old when we received the devastating news last week. But that wasn't the case. When we first found out, we just let her know that her cousin had passed away and left it at that, and she was okay. But as the day wore on and the conversations between her sisters and us continued and the gravity of the loss was felt, she knew that this was actually
different.
It was different. There was a difference to the grief that we were experiencing in our home. And sitting around the dinner table, she wanted to know what happened. And she actually asked, how did he die? And that was a really hard conversation to have, but I knew that in spite of the fact that I wanted to protect her, I actually needed to be honest with her.
So let's build on what we've talked about for young children. Those same principles apply. We want to keep it simple. We want to use the principle of the fire hose, and we want to make sure that they understand the meanings of the words. You were masterful. As we sat around the dining table last Monday night, the first thing that we did was we said to the children, everybody's had a pretty rough day. It's been a really, really bumpy day for us emotionally. Does anybody have any questions? And the first question to come up came from Emily. Middle childhood. We're talking about kids 7 to 12. She's right in the centre of that, age 9. And she said, how did he die? And that's when you, instead of just diving in and answering the question, asked her a question. Have you ever heard of suicide? Do you know what suicide means? And she was hesitant and unsure, but she took a guess and she was right. She did know what it meant. And so we began a conversation about how that was how Logan had died. But then she wanted more detail. She said, how did he do it? And once again, based on all the very best research that I can find and based on the best advice from the very best advisory groups that exist, we decided that honesty was the best policy. And I took a hugely deep breath. I was walking around the table at the time and walking past you, and I put my hand on your shoulder and thought, oh no, how do we do this? And you stepped straight in. And in minor detail, without giving anything more than a gentle little sip of water to her, metaphorically, you explained enough. At which point her desire for information was satisfied. She didn't ask for any more. And we were able to move the conversation forward from there. I think when it comes to middle childhood and even with teenagers, those are going to be the best principles for us to lean on. It's the fire hose principle. It's keeping it simple. It's answering questions to the degree to which they're curious, offering lots of empathy, and making sure that they understand. With everything that we've said, let's run through a handful of general points. This may be a little bit repetitive, but it's worth doing it, and there's definitely some ideas that we haven't shared so far. The first one, keep it simple. The second one, operate on the principle of the fire hose. The third one, if they ask why, tell them, but keep it age appropriate. They don't need to know all of the skeletons in the closet, just the basics. And the more general you can be, the safer you'll be, particularly when they're young. So the person had a disease in their head and they died, and it's very sad, is a wonderful start. If they say, what do you mean? We might have a conversation about depression. Or, I mean, it's different in every family. There might have been something going on in terms of money problems or relationship problems or whatever. But we want to try to protect our children and our broader family to the degree that that's responsible behaviour. Next, if they ask how, the National Centre for Childhood Grief says to tell them, but to keep it age appropriate. Next, remember that talking about it actually helps to dispel misinformation and stigma. And rather than creating ideas in our children's head, research indicates that it creates a safe space to ask questions. And so you want to encourage your children to ask questions at any time and to talk with you at any time. And that's something that we've done all week long. For the last week and a half, that's all we've done.
The powerful thing about being able to have conversations with your kids, honest, heartfelt conversations with them, is that they are so perceptive. And as the week has gone on, the emotions have varied and varied in intensity and have been different from day to day. You know, you talk about the stages of grief. There's been anger. There's been deep, deep sadness. There's been just a lot of hurt and pain. And because of those honest conversations, I think that the children haven't felt afraid of them because they've understood the depth and the immensity of the situation, even if they don't fully understand it, because we were honest with them. When we're not able to have those conversations with our kids, they're left wondering and they fill in the gaps of what they think's going on, and that's never helpful for anyone.
Thank you. Let me share a couple of other ideas that matter a lot. Now, I've already said this, but I want to re-emphasize it. Research shows that talking about it safely doesn't exacerbate or amplify risk. In fact, you and I have had a very, very clear conversation with our kids, very, very clear. And one thing that we did was I shared a story about how early in our marriage, we didn't have any kind of disagreement or argument in our marriage for at least 9 months, 10 months. But somewhere towards the end of the first year of our marriage, we had our first argument, our first blow up. And we'd never had one before. And so I don't know how big it actually was, but it felt like a doozy. And during the course of that argument, 25 years ago now, you said something about getting divorced. And I remember in that moment, I said to you something along the lines of, we can never use that word in the context of this relationship. It's off the table. It's not an option. We don't joke about it and we absolutely don't threaten it. We are committed to one another. We love one another and we will work this out. Now, in hindsight, I don't necessarily believe that entirely. If somebody is in a relationship that is not safe, then divorce has to be an option. In fact, the reason the divorce exists is so that we can make sure that we do treat each other well. But I think that taking it off the table changed the nature of our relationship. We looked at the decision we'd made to be married as irreversible. And because we knew that we were safe together, it was good that it was irreversible. We shared that with our children, one at a time, as we sat with them and talked about Logan's death. And we talked about suicide. We said that in the same way that it's fine to use the word divorce. It's fine to talk about the concept of divorce and even to talk about people who have been divorced. In the context of our relationship, we don't talk about that as being an option because we love each other and we will work through the challenges that we have when they arise. Similarly, when it comes to suicide, it's perfectly fine to say the word. It's also perfectly reasonable to talk about it, ask about it, learn about it. But we need to be really clear that it has to come off the table as an option when life gets hard. It has to come off the table as something that we would ever contemplate when we don't know how to resolve the problems that we're facing. It can't be an option. Now, that sounds in some ways like a terribly harsh thing to say. It sounds like it's a confronting and provocative thing to say. But the more I've thought about it, and I've actually shared this with a couple of friends who are psychologists and asked them what they thought, and they agreed, absolutely. This is something that we want to take off the table. We do not want our kids, our teenagers, running around thinking that it's an option because we don't need this heartache, and every problem is solvable. There is a way through every challenge that we or our children might experience, and that's the message that we need to get through to them. It's not an option. Take it off the table because the tsunami of grief that it doesn't just ripple out, it sweeps across the family and friends and the communities that are affected is just insurmountable in so many ways. It is so extraordinarily large.
I think the only other thing we haven't really talked about is just acknowledging that our kids are going to have different emotions around it. And
in an hour, they're going to have different emotions, let alone across a week and a half.
And sometimes it's not actually helpful to ask them how they're feeling because just like there have been multiple times this week where I haven't really understood what I'm feeling, there's just so much emotion. Our kids are trying to work this out and understand it. And so they just need to know that there's a safe place to have a cry, have a hug, and not have to explain themselves.
The kids had a remote control war the other day, like literally a big war in the living room over who got to hold the remote control. They weren't even changing the channels. They weren't changing anything. They just fought over who was going to hold the remote. And I don't think that misbehavior was really about the remote control. I think it was about the pent-up emotion and the challenges and the difficulties that are associated with going through this grieving process. Recognizing that emotions are contagious, recognizing that sometimes kids don't want to talk, sometimes they don't know how they're feeling, sometimes we don't, that there may be some misbehavior. Those things are all going to be important in navigating this very, very tricky and challenging time.
And somehow, in spite of our own grief, we have to find a way to be softer on ourselves and softer on our kids as they start to work through everything together.
Tomorrow, in our I'll Do Better Tomorrow episode, it's going to be short, but we're going to talk specifically about that very thing and why it's so important and what the last 10 or 12 days have taught us as a family about kindness and love and goodness. I hope that you'll join us for a conversation that I think will make your family think about so much about what you do so differently. Thank you so much for joining us in a fairly somber conversation about a very difficult topic. We hope that it has been helpful and we hope that it gives you some guidance as to how you can navigate these tricky moments in your own homes and families. As always, we appreciate so much the work of both Justin Rulon, our producer, and Craig Bruce, our executive producer, for the work that they do on making the Happy Families podcast available to you. If you'd like more information about making your family happier, visit happyfamilies.com.au. And if anything that we've talked about today has created any challenges for you that you need to talk about, please talk to somebody. You can Google all kinds of assistance lines if you jump online, or just pick up the phone and ring somebody you love and trust.